Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member. But today we listened again to the Prime Minister telling us we had a strong economy. And yet, of course, when Labour left office, there was simply 26,000 people a year going to food banks. Now there's 2.6 million, 100 times that number. We heard, oh yes, we've got a strong economy. There's 500,000 more people in work than before the COVID pandemic. But of course, according to the ONS, there's 444,000 fewer people at work because the Prime Minister conveniently missed out the self-employed. He said, oh, we're the low-tax party. But of course, taxes are now at a 50-year high. The Chancellor increased taxes by £40 billion last year. We're at a share of GDP which hasn't been that level since Attlee, when we were coming out of the Second World War and needed to charge those taxes. Inflation is at a 40-year high. There's a departmental freeze on spending, so there's savage cuts going across the board. And I can see the Secretary of State for Brexit opportunity and government inefficiency living up to his name in terms of the delivery of inefficiency, chattering away. The truth is, of course, that inflation is helping, ironically, the government's revenues, because they've got a 4-year freeze on personal allowances and tax thresholds, which will actually mean there's a sort of creeping increase in tax as people sink into tax thresholds and the allowances in real terms go down. And this actually means that the planned cynical attempt to drop tax before the next election in 24-25, that tax increase will actually be gobbled up by that inflationary clawback. And people, in fact, will think they're getting a tax cut, but they will lose twice the amount of that tax cut. I mean, is there an alternative to this? And the answer, of course, is yes. And where's the evidence? And the evidence is that in the 10 years to 2008 that Labour were in power, the economy grew by 40%. And we use those proceeds not to just give them away, but to double investment in the health service, double investment in education, and bring millions of young people and pensioners out of poverty. We bequeathed a debt to GDP ratio of 45%. It's now 90%, a doubling of the share of debt. And in fact, the Institute of Fiscal Studies has said had that trend growth continued, people would be £11,000 better off than they are today. So they'd be much more resilient to taking on board some of the global shocks that we all can see, whether it's Ukraine or COVID or whatever. It is catastrophic mismanagement. We saw from 2010, of course, it started with Osborne's austerity that simply didn't work. It just drove down growth because people were expecting there might perhaps be one of the 400,000 people he said he was going to sack. We then had the sort of stupidity of the hard Brexit, where we decided we'd all be outside the single market. And there's no move now for product realignment or a minimum amount of worker movement to allow lower cost market access, which is what businesses want. So a third of businesses who've been exporting the EU are now saying they won't do it at all. So we've got a low growth, high cuts, high tax, cut in wages government. It's a complete failure. Now, the answer to this, the complete answer to this isn't a windfall tax, I appreciate, but let's understand what a windfall tax is. The oil companies work on a marginal profit, which is quite healthy, and then all of a sudden Putin invades, there's an escalation in the price, and there's literally a massive tax profit over the cost of production. Now, they didn't do anything about that to deserve that. That is Putin's profit, and the people here deserve that profit to help them go through the hard times we're going through because we're imposing sanctions. And sanctions, of course, take time. The IMF is saying that the sanctions will cut Russian economy by 8.5%. They won't stop a Russian tank. And that war, of course, needs to be won to sort this situation out. But that's another story. We certainly do need to increase productivity. But the reality is, the ambition of the Chancellor is to bring the investment per child in education in 2024 up to the 2010 levels we had with Labour. Our young people need to be invested in now. There's talk about, everyone's got to go back to the office. As has been said to the man on the front bench, we've all got to go back to work in the traditional way. But the Office of National Statistics did a study to show that there'd be a very considerable increase in productivity and a delay in people retiring if people were allowed to work from home. In particular, women, in particular people caring, in particular people looking after families could work flexibly. And what's more, obviously if, 1 in 5 days you were at home, then you take 20% out of the congestion on the roads, or the traffic of the roads, you take 80% of the congestion out. So we spend less on roads and it'd be carbon friendly. So in other words, the whole approach in terms of productivity, in terms of a green investment, in terms of cognizance of that is completely ridiculous. Macron has said, as Italy has been saying, Germany, why don't we have a situation where we can have a more collaborative approach to trade with Britain, and indeed bring in Ukraine because they share the same values. And again, all we're doing is starting a sort of trade war on the back of what is a very sensible arrangement, namely that Ireland should be in the single market to protect the single market. I mean, and obviously the people, that's what the government's agreed, and that's what we should continue with. And finally, other than the economic catastrophe and this clear solution for moving forward, I have fears that there's also an attack on a fundamental rights and democracy. If you read the Queen's speech, there's all this stuff about reducing the power of an independent judiciary. Now we've seen, haven't we, since obviously the government's very angry with Miller because they gave us a vote on the deal, very angry with the judiciary allowing, democracy to be reconvened after the Prime Minister tried to abandon it for a long period of time. So the Supreme Court composition has been changed. 7 of its key decisions have been reversed. It's been intimidated by the media and ministers sitting there slagging it off. In particular, the Lord Chancellor is supposed to defend it. The average tenure of the Lord Chancellor is now 1.5 years. It used to be 4 years. He used to be a senior judge or judicial member who'd respect, instead of someone who was just wanting to get to the next ministerial position. So our independent judiciary is under attack, our rights are under attack, our democracy is under attack, and I respect the points that were made by the member for Paisley and French South about the rolling authoritarianism we see in terms of poverty, into the economy and the democracy and what we fundamentally are. Frankly, we are better than this. We deserve better than this. We don't want low growth, low cuts, low wages. We want high growth, a fairer, stronger economy in the future. And let's roll forward and deliver that with a Labour government.